It was a quiet, unsuspecting night in a suburban neighborhood. The world seemed at peace, except for one moment, one encounter that would change everything. What would you do if you were wrongfully accused of something you didn't do? But what if, in that moment, you were more powerful than anyone could imagine? The man, standing on the sidewalk, hadn't done anything wrong. He was simply walking home from work, his mind lost in thought. It was just another evening, until the lights flashed behind him. A police car pulled up, its siren cutting through the stillness of the night. The officer inside ordered him to stop, his voice sharp and commanding. "Step aside," the cop barked. The man froze for a second, his heart skipping a beat. He had done nothing to deserve this. But in an instant, the world shifted from normality to danger. Why was this happening? Was it because of his race, or was there something deeper to this encounter? The air was thick with tension as the officer stepped out of the car, his eyes scanning the man, ready to judge him for something he couldn't even fathom. The officer's tone was dismissive as he demanded the man's ID. "Let me see your identification." Now his eyes roamed the man's features, his judgment clouded. The black man stood tall, calm, collected. He didn't react to the officer's aggression, his voice steady as he simply handed over his ID. But there was no fear in his eyes. He wasn't going to give the officer what he wanted, the response he expected. "Why are you stopping me?" the man asked, his calm voice cutting through the officer's hostility. The officer didn't answer, instead eyeing him with suspicion, his every word dripping with condescension. "I'm just trying to get home," the man added, his voice holding a quiet strength. But the officer wasn't listening. His mind was made up. The bias was clear. This was a case of racial profiling. The black man didn't fit the officer's idea of what normal was, and the officer wasn't going to let him go without questioning him further. As the man mentioned his job, the officer brushed it off, his irritation growing. "Doesn't matter what you do for a living. I'm doing my job." But the man's job was more than the officer could ever imagine. And that tiny detail was the one thing that could change everything. The officer's attitude escalated. His questions became sharper, more aggressive. But still, the black man stood there, not raising his voice, not showing the slightest sign of anger. He was a picture of composure, knowing that reacting with anger would only play into the officer's expectations. "You need to come with me," the officer demanded, his hand twitching near his belt. And then, a radio call cut through the tension. "Dispatch to Unit 45. Be advised. The suspect in question is an FBI agent. Proceed accordingly." The officer's face went pale. The words didn't sink in immediately. He paused, his mind racing as the words echoed in his head. FBI agent, what did that mean? For a brief moment, the black man remained silent, letting the officer process the information. The officer's eyes widened as he realized what he had done. His hands shook slightly, no longer confident in his authority. The truth began to dawn on him. He had just tried to arrest someone far more important than he could ever understand. The officer was now visibly sweating, his earlier confidence evaporating. He tried to stutter out an apology, his voice strained. I'm sorry, I didn't." But the man cut him off. His calm voice, filled with quiet dignity, resonated in the night air. "You judged me before even knowing my name," he said, his eyes locked on the officer. "But now you know who I am, don't you?" In that moment, the power of racial bias became crystal clear. The officer had assumed the worst because of the man's appearance, his skin color clouding his judgment before he even bothered to understand who he was. This wasn't just about a simple mistake. It was about the bigger picture, the systemic issues that many people of color face on a daily basis. The black man took a deep breath, and in a rare, vulnerable moment, his voice cracked slightly. "I shouldn't have to prove myself to you," he said softly. "I shouldn't have to prove my worth to anyone, but I do. Every day." The words stung. It was the truth, one that resonated deeply with anyone who had faced discrimination. He wasn't just talking about this one officer. He was talking about a society that constantly judged him based on his skin color. His voice carried the weight of every person who had ever been treated as less than simply because of how they looked. The fallout was swift. The officer's career was now on the line. Internal investigations were launched. His actions, fueled by ignorance and bias, had brought unwanted attention upon him. But as the officer's future hung in the balance, the black man remained silent about what he would do next. He wasn't interested in revenge. He didn't need to destroy the officer's life. His power lay in something far stronger: restraint. The ability to walk away, to rise above the hate and judgment, was what gave him the true strength in that moment. The man reflected on his journey. He had worked tirelessly, not just to become an FBI agent, but to prove to himself that he could rise above the biases society had placed on him. He had never let people's prejudices define him, and he wasn't about to start now. Sometimes he thought to himself, the most powerful thing you can do is show patience, dignity, and self-control. That's where the real power lies. News of the incident spread like wildfire. The black man's story made headlines, but it wasn't about him, it was about what he stood for. It was about the fight against racial profiling, against prejudice, and against the systems that perpetuated injustice. The man's calmness in the face of unwarranted aggression became a beacon of hope for many. He didn't need to raise his fist to make a difference, he simply needed to raise his voice and speak the truth. As the story spread, the conversation shifted. People began to ask themselves how many others had been unjustly treated, how many lives had been altered simply because of who they were. And the question lingered: how can we change this? The black man's story became a rallying cry, not for revenge but for a call to action. Sometimes he said in the final words of his statement, "The greatest power lies in the restraint we show in the face of ignorance." Days passed since the incident, and the black man found himself reflecting on that moment. He could have reacted differently, perhaps with anger or resentment. But he knew that would only perpetuate the cycle of hatred and misunderstanding. What made him proud wasn't that he had remained calm, though. That was important. It was that he had refused to let that officer's actions define him. In his quiet moments, he thought about how many times he had been judged based on his appearance. How many times had people made assumptions about him simply because of the color of his skin? He had been a part of a system that was supposed to protect people, yet he had never been immune to the prejudice that so many people of color experienced every day. But despite all of that, he had chosen a different path. He had chosen to rise above the hatred. His dignity was his armor. And it wasn't just about proving others wrong, it was about proving to himself that he could stay true to who he was, no matter the circumstances. Back in his precinct, the officer found himself caught in a storm of regret. He replayed the events over and over in his mind, each time with a sinking feeling in his chest. He had been wrong. He had been part of a system that hurt people, not helped them. The officer wasn't a bad man. He wasn't a racist by design, but he had been raised in a world where assumptions about black men had been ingrained in him. He wasn't aware of how deeply those biases ran until that moment. As the investigation into his actions began, he was forced to confront the ugly truth about the way he had treated the man. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a reflection of a deeper issue that needed to be addressed, both in himself and in the system. The guilt ate at him. He had seen the man's calmness, his dignity, and now he realized how deeply he had misjudged him. That moment would stay with him forever, a lesson learned the hard way. As news outlets picked up the story, the public's reaction was swift. Protests erupted, not just because of one man's arrest, but because of the countless other instances where people of color had been wrongly accused or mistreated by law enforcement. People rallied in support of the black man. His story became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that no one should ever be judged by the color of their skin. His calm and restraint in the face of aggression became a beacon of hope for many, and his story helped to open a dialogue about racial profiling and police brutality. The man's voice became louder, more powerful. He wasn't just an FBI agent, he was a symbol of something much greater. His actions sparked a conversation that had been long overdue. The world was starting to listen. Several weeks later, the officer reached out to the black man. His career was hanging by a thread, but it wasn't the job he was worried about anymore. It was the damage he had done to the man, to his community, and to himself. "I want to apologize," the officer said, his voice shaky. "I didn't know who you were, and I judged you before I knew anything about you. I'm sorry." The black man listened. He wasn't sure what to say at first. The officer's apology wasn't going to fix everything. It wasn't going to undo the harm that had been done. But in that moment, the black man understood something profound. The officer had taken the first step in realizing his mistake, and that was something. "You didn't know who I was," the man said calmly, his voice steady. "But that's the problem. You didn't even care to know. It wasn't just about me. It was about how we, as a society, treat people based on assumptions. The officer nodded, deeply moved by the man's words. I see that now, he said quietly. And though it wasn't an easy road to forgiveness, the man knew that this moment was an important one, a reminder that real change could only come when people were willing to face the truth and accept responsibility for their actions. The incident didn't just fade away. It sparked a movement. The black man's story continued to resonate with people across the country. He was no longer just an FBI agent, he was a symbol of hope, of strength, and of the possibility for change. The officer's life had changed, too. He had learned a lesson that would shape his career and his worldview. He would never again make assumptions based on the color of someone's skin. He would approach each situation with an open mind, determined not to let his biases cloud his judgment. The black man, now a quiet figure in the background of the media storm, knew that his life had meaning beyond the badge he wore. He had made a difference, not through grand gestures or public displays of anger, but through his simple, steadfast refusal to let hatred win. Sometimes, he thought as he walked down the street, the greatest power lies in the restraint we show in the face of ignorance. That's where true change begins. And with that thought, he continued on his path stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to stand against the forces of hate and injustice. Because, as he knew all too well, the fight for equality was a long one, but he was ready for it. The story didn't end with a simple apology. It continued, not just in headlines but in the hearts and minds of those who had heard it. The message was clear: we all have a responsibility to challenge our assumptions and fight against the biases that exist within us and in the systems around us. The black man's journey was a testament to the power of dignity, restraint, and wisdom. His story wasn't just about one man and one cop. It was about the countless individuals who had faced discrimination and injustice and had decided to rise above it, to fight for a better world. As the world watched, the call for change grew louder. People were starting to demand more from their leaders, more from their institutions, and more from each other. And that, perhaps, was the greatest victory of all. Sometimes the greatest power lies in the restraint we show in the face of ignorance. Stand strong. Speak up. And never let anyone define your worth.